The pounding on the door wasn't a knock. It was a breach attempt, the kind of violent, rhythmic thudding that shakes the dust off the doorframe and sends a primal spike of adrenaline straight into your fight-or-flight center. 3 men in full tactical gear were screaming police. Open up immediately. While I stood in my garage, frozen not by fear but by a calculating, cold rage, watching the feed on my security monitor. They had the vests, the utility belts, the aggressive posture of a dynamic entry team, and a black SUV idling in my driveway with enforcement stenciled on the side, looking for all the world like a legitimate SWAT unit coming to take down a cartel boss. But my crime wasn't drug trafficking or money laundering. My crime was growing organic tomatoes and flying a flag that my HOA president, a woman I've come to know as Patricia Sterling, didn't like. Through the grainy 4K resolution of the camera lens, I watched them fan out, checking corners, hands hovering near holsters that looked suspiciously like props, and something in my gut, that instinct honed over 2 decades of logistics work for the Army, screamed that this was wrong. The way they moved was sloppy, theatrical, lacking the tight, fluid economy of motion that actual operators have. That's when I heard the low, throaty purr of a different engine, a government-issued Charger pulling in behind them, blocking their exit, and my wife, Agent Sarah Thorne, stepped out, her hand resting casually near her waist, her badge catching the sunlight like a shield of divine intervention. What those men didn't know, what Patricia Sterling didn't know, was that they weren't intimidating a helpless retiree. They were about to commit a felony in front of a high-ranking deputy U.S. Marshal, and the hammer was about to drop so hard it would shatter their entire reality. But to understand how we got to this standoff, to this moment where fake cops were about to wet themselves in my driveway, you have to go back 3 months, back to when I thought I had found heaven on earth. My name is Elias Thorne, and after 24 years of moving shipping containers, coordinating supply lines, and breathing in diesel fumes in deserts halfway across the world, all I wanted was silence, the smell of sawdust, and a plot of land where no one shouted orders at me. Sarah and I closed on a beautiful corner lot in Oak Ridge Sanctuary, a sleepy, manicured subdivision 30 minutes outside of Seattle, surrounded by pine trees and the promise of a quiet life. The first few weeks were pure bliss, the kind of peace you feel deep in your bones. I'd drink my coffee on the porch, listening to the birds, smelling the rain on the asphalt, watching Sarah leave for the federal courthouse in her crisp business suits, her badge clipped to her belt, looking like the superhero she is. She spent her days hunting down white-collar fugitives, people who stole millions and ran, while I spent my days building raised planter boxes for a vegetable garden and organizing my workshop, sorting screws by thread count, finding joy in the absolute control I had over my own little kingdom. It was perfect. It was the American dream packaged in cedar fencing and fresh soil, until the day a white Range Rover with license plates reading Queen Bee rolled up to my curb like a tank invading a border town. Out stepped Patricia Sterling, a woman in her late 50s wearing a floral blazer that cost more than my first car and a smile that was all teeth and zero warmth. She held a clipboard like a weapon, scanning my property with the critical eye of a sniper looking for a target. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with that sickeningly sweet condescension that sets your teeth on edge. "I'm Patricia, president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, and I'm afraid we have a bit of a situation with these agricultural structures." She pointed a manicured nail at my garden beds, which were built to code, stained, and leveled with laser precision. They disrupt the visual harmony of the street. Violation 402, $50 fine, escalating to a lien on your property if not removed in 30 days. I blinked, taking the citation she shoved into my hand, feeling the heat rise up my neck, not because of the money, but because of the audacity, the sheer pettiness of it. I politely told her I'd look into it, but as she drove away, I saw her slow down in front of the Kowalski residence, a retired Air Force family, and scribble something else down. That night, over dinner, I showed the citation to Sarah, who just laughed that dry, cynical laugh of someone who's seen the worst of humanity. "Honey," she said, swirling her wine, "this isn't about aesthetics. This is about dominance. She's testing the perimeter, seeing if you'll roll over." I did what any good logistics man does. I gathered intelligence. I walked the neighborhood, talking to the Kowalskis, who told me they were getting hammered with fines for their American flag being too large. and the Nguyen's, a sweet couple from Vietnam, who were being cited for their impeccably trimmed hedges being the wrong species of shrub. Meanwhile, I noticed that the houses belonging to Patricia's inner circle, the board members who nodded along to her every word, had boats in the driveways, weeds in the cracks, and peeling paint, yet they never received a single slip of paper. It was selective enforcement, weaponized bureaucracy designed to push out anyone who didn't kiss the ring. And when I filed a formal dispute, requesting the meeting minutes and the specific bylaws she claimed I was violating, Patricia didn't just deny it, she declared war. 3 days after my request, a second violation arrived, this time for unauthorized patriotic display, my flag, the one I had carried in my rucksack overseas, the one that meant more to me than this house ever could. She claimed it was visually aggressive, a term that doesn't even exist in the legal code, and included a note saying that further resistance would result in compliance inspections. That phrase, compliance inspections, stuck in my craw. It sounded less like a neighborhood rule and more like a threat from a totalitarian regime. I started digging into Patricia Sterling, pulling public records, and found she had been running this HOA for 6 years, unopposed, treating the association's bank account like her personal piggy bank, while her husband, Arthur Sterling, a meek man who worked in county records, trailed behind her like a beaten dog. The escalation began in earnest when a man named Derek Vance knocked on my door at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday, wearing a polo shirt with a logo for Sentinel Community Management, holding a tape measure and looking nervous. "I'm here for the mandatory compliance inspection authorized by the board," he mumbled, refusing to look me in the eye, trying to step past me into my backyard. I blocked the doorway with my shoulder, crossing my arms. "Let's see the business license, the insurance bond, and the specific written authorization from the board meeting where this was voted on," I said, my voice low and dangerous. Derek stammered, shuffling his papers. I report directly to Mrs. Sterling. She said I have authority." I sent him packing, but not before snapping a photo of his license plate, which Sarah ran through her system later that night. The results were chilling. Sentinel Community Management didn't exist. The car was registered to a private security firm called Blackwatch Protection, a company with a D- rating from the Better Business Bureau and a history of lawsuits for intimidation and impersonating officers. Patricia wasn't hiring property managers. She was hiring goons, using our own HOA dues to pay for mercenaries to harass us. And when I pulled the HOA financials, which took a threat of legal action to get, the numbers didn't add up, tens of thousands of dollars flowing into vague consulting fees. We were dealing with embezzlement on a massive scale, and Patricia Sterling had no idea she had just picked a fight with a man who specialized in supply chain forensics and a woman who hunted criminals for a living. The deeper we dug, the darker the hole got. It wasn't just petty theft. It was a systemic dismantling of our community's spirit, funded by our own checkbooks. The financial records I finally wrestled from the management company were a roadmap of corruption. Invoices for emergency landscaping in the dead of winter, payments to Sentinel for services that were never rendered, and checks signed solely by Patricia without the required second signature from the treasurer. I spent nights in my garage, which Sarah had jokingly dubbed the war room, pinning documents to a corkboard, connecting dates and dollar amounts with red string like I was tracking a serial killer, because in a way, she was killing the neighborhood. I started holding secret meetings in my backyard, dubbed the Garden Club, where the Kowalskis, the Nguyen's, and Mrs. Higgins, a sweet older lady who was being threatened with fines for her bird feeder, gathered to compare notes. The fear in their eyes was palpable. Patricia had gaslit them into believing they were the problem, that they were bad neighbors. But as I laid out the spreadsheets showing the $28,000 diverted to Blackwatch Protection, their fear turned to anger. We were building a coalition, a resistance movement armed with bylaws and spreadsheets. But Patricia, sensing her grip slipping, decided to turn up the heat, and that's when she made her fatal mistake. She stopped pretending to follow the rules and started playing dirty. It started with the city inspector, a guy in a pristine, store-bought orange vest and a hard hat that looked like it had never seen a construction site, who showed up claiming he needed to measure my fence line for a municipal setback violation. I was drinking coffee on the deck when he let himself in through the side gate, his tape measure snapping aggressively against the wood. "City Building Authority," he barked without looking up, We have reports of illegal grading. I didn't say a word. I just pulled out my phone, put it on speaker, and called the actual city planning department right there in front of him. Hi, this is Elias Thorne. I have an inspector on my property. Can you confirm his dispatch number? The silence from the fake inspector was deafening as the city clerk on the phone confirmed, loudly, that no inspectors were in the area and that impersonating a city official was a crime. The color drained from the guy's face. He muttered something about wrong address and practically sprinted to his truck, peeling out of the driveway while I filmed his retreat in 4K resolution. Sarah watched the footage later, her eyes narrowing. Impersonating a municipal employee is bad, she murmured. But if they escalate to federal impersonation, Elias, that's a felony that puts you in federal prison for years, not months. We knew Patricia was desperate. She was bleeding money and authority, and desperate people do stupid, dangerous things. Then came the bombshell, the twist that turned this from a neighborhood squabble into a federal case. Sarah came home late one Tuesday, tossing a manila folder onto the kitchen island with a heavy thud, her face unreadable. I ran a deeper background check on your nemesis, she said, pouring herself a glass of water. Turns out, Patricia Sterling isn't her real name, or rather, it is now. But back in Arizona, she was known as Patricia Vance. She flipped the folder open to reveal a mugshot from 6 years ago. Younger, less makeup, but the same cold, dead eyes. She has an active, unextradited warrant for felony tax evasion and fraud. She was running an HOA scam in Scottsdale, skimming off the top until the heat got too hot. Then she bolted, married Arthur, and reinvented herself here. My jaw hit the floor. Our tormentor wasn't just a Karen. She was a fugitive, a criminal on the run who couldn't help but return to the scene of her crime, like an addict addicted to power. So we arrest her? I asked, already reaching for my phone. Sarah shook her head, a shark-like grin spreading across her face. No, not yet. The warrant is for tax evasion, which is boring and takes years to litigate. But if she continues this harassment, if she uses these fake security goons to intimidate a federal officer's family, she commits a new crime, a violent crime, here in our jurisdiction. We were going to let her dig her own grave. We were going to give her enough rope to hang herself and the entire corrupt board with her. The bait was a certified letter I sent to the board, demanding a public audit and informing them that I would be presenting my evidence of embezzlement at the next town hall. It was a declaration of war, and Patricia's response was swift and frantic. First came the bribe attempt. A woman claiming to be a relocation specialist called, offering me $5,000 cash and moving expenses if I would just leave the community for a better fit. When I laughed in her face, the tone shifted. We spent the weekend turning our house into a fortress of surveillance, hiding cameras in the birdhouses, the eaves, the flower pots, ensuring that every square inch of the driveway and front porch was covered from multiple angles. We needed proof, undeniable, high-definition proof of her next move. Mrs. Higgins came over Sunday night, clutching a printed email she'd found in Arthur Sterling's briefcase. Her husband played poker with Arthur and had swiped it. The email was from Patricia to Blackwatch Protection. Current measures ineffective. Need immediate removal of resident at 402. Authorization for full tactical intimidation granted. Use the uniforms. Make him scared enough to leave. Use the uniforms. That phrase hung in the air like smoke. They weren't sending a guy in a polo shirt this time. They were escalating to a raid. Patricia was so delusional, so wrapped up in her own little kingdom, that she thought she could send mercenaries dressed as cops to kick down a door in the United States of America. Sarah checked her service weapon, her movements precise and calm. Tomorrow, she said, looking at the email timestamp. They're coming tomorrow afternoon. We didn't sleep much that night, not out of fear, but out of anticipation, like hunters waiting in a blind, waiting for the prey to walk right into the crosshairs. The trap was set, the cameras were rolling, and the stage was perfectly lit for the final act of Patricia Sterling's downfall. It was 2:15 p.m. when the convoy arrived. Not a subtle approach, but a shock in a wee display intended to terrify. The black SUV screeched to a halt, followed closely by a white van, and out poured the 3 men in tactical gear I mentioned earlier, their vests laden with pouches, their hands resting on what looked like pepper spray launchers and batons. They pounded on the door, screaming about obstruction of justice and immediate entry warrants. Terms that sounded scary to a layman but were absolute gibberish to anyone who knew the law. I watched from the garage, phone in hand, live streaming the audio to Sarah, who was staged just around the corner, waiting for the signal. "Open the door, or we will breach," the leader screamed, kicking the bottom of the door frame. That was the line. That was the threat of violence. "Go," I whispered into the phone. The roar of Sarah's Charger was the sound of cavalry arriving. She drifted the car into the driveway, blocking them in, and stepped out. The transformation in the demeanor of the fake cops was instant and pathetic. One moment they were tough guys, the next they were deer in headlights, staring at a legitimate federal badge that eclipsed their fake enforcement patches like the sun eclipsing a candle. Federal agents. Hands where I can see them. Now, Sarah's voice wasn't loud. It was projected, a command voice that bypassed the ears and went straight to the spine. The leader tried to stammer. "We were authorized by the HOA. Sarah cut him off, advancing with her hand on her weapon. "You are impersonating law enforcement officers in the commission of a felony intimidation. Get on the ground." By the time I opened the garage door, actual sirens were wailing in the distance. Sarah had called in the cavalry. Local PD, confused but cooperative, swarmed the street, and within minutes, the 3 tactical operators were handcuffed, sitting on the curb, weeping as they realized they weren't getting a paycheck, they were getting felony charges. But the cherry on top, the moment of pure cinematic justice, arrived 10 minutes later. Patricia Sterling pulled up in her Range Rover, rolling down the window with a look of expectant glee, thinking she was arriving to see me being dragged out in cuffs. Instead, she saw her private army arrested and Agent Sarah Thorne walking towards her car with a pair of steel bracelets. Patricia tried to roll up the window, screaming, "This is a mistake. I am the president." Sarah didn't even flinch. She opened the car door and pulled Patricia out. "Mrs. Sterling, or should I say Ms. Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy, impersonation of a federal officer, and oh yeah, that outstanding warrant from Arizona." The scene was chaotic and beautiful. The Kowalskis, the Nguyen's, Mrs. Higgins, the whole garden club came out onto their lawns, holding up their phones, recording the tyrant being stuffed into the back of a police cruiser. A local news van, tipped off by me earlier that morning, caught the whole thing, Patricia screaming about her rights while Arthur Sterling stood in the background, looking relieved, actually relieved, that the nightmare was over. The look on Patricia's face as she realized her reign of terror had ended not with a bang, but with the cold click of handcuffs, was something I will cherish forever. In the months that followed, the justice system did its work with brutal efficiency. The 3 fake cops rolled on Patricia immediately for a plea deal, admitting she paid them extra to use physical force if necessary. They got 18 months each. Patricia wasn't so lucky. Between the Arizona tax fraud, the embezzlement of over $40,000 from the Oak Ridge HOA, and the federal charges for the conspiracy against a Marshal's family, she was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. We seized the assets, the Range Rover, the boat, the vacation fund, and returned every cent to the HOA accounts. Oak Ridge Sanctuary is different now. Mrs. Higgins was elected the new president, and her first act was to abolish the fines for gardens and flags. We used the recovered money to build a community playground and fix the roads. I still sit on my porch, drinking my coffee, looking at my raised beds and my American flag waving in the wind, but the silence is sweeter now because it's the sound of freedom, not fear. We stood up, we fought back, and we won. But it leaves me with a question, one that I think about when I look at the empty house where Patricia used to live. How many other neighborhoods are out there right now, ruled by petty tyrants who think a little bit of power gives them the right to destroy lives? And at what point does following the rules become complicity in evil? We drew a line in the sand, but I wonder, would you have done the same, or would you have paid the fine just to keep the peace? Because peace without justice isn't peace at all, it's just submission. Thanks for watching, stay safe, keep your cameras rolling, and never let a bully with a clipboard tell you how to live your life. See you in the next one.